Hi guys, welcome to another video from Kurdistan by Soane. Today I wanted to talk more about my dissertation proposal, which I mentioned briefly in the last video about the Mosul Vilayet and oil concessions. And basically I had my first meeting with my supervisor on the 10th of June 2026, and I had to sort of write an abstract, write a 500-word abstract, which I haven't done yet. I'm going to start after this video. But originally, to get picked for a supervisor, we had to write sort of a 200-word abstract explaining the project. So I just wanted to go through that and kind of explain what I'm planning to do, etc. So my title, well, obviously not none of this is finalized yet, and it's just sort of like a first draft of anything. So the title I proposed was The Pipeline Paradox, Oil Empire and the Destruction of Kurdish Political Agency in the Mosul Vilayet, 1914 to 1932. And here I have sort of a description below. This dissertation examines how British oil interests drove the systematic destruction of Kurdish political agency in the Mosul Vilayet between 1914 and 1932. Utilizing institutional path dependency theory, which, to explain it off the top of my head, it's basically when institutions develop and the regulations within these institutions sort of like how Iraq was sort of constructed for oil, and sort of like the Mesopotamian campaign was one of the primary drivers was for oil. It was institutionalized within the government that Mosul and northern Iraq had to be part of Iraq, sort of. So the Kurdish areas, I mean. And basically this makes it hard to reverse. It's very difficult to reverse within institutionalized sort of decisions. Off the top of my head, I'm sure there's many better descriptions from cited sources, etc. So this dissertation will argue that Kurdish leaders articulated clear demands for self-determination through diplomacy at the Paris Peace Conference, for example, Sharif Pasha, the Kurdish envoy to Paris from 1919 to 1920, or through revolts in Suleymania, which were in 1919, 1922, 1924, and 1930, which are all Sheikh Mahmoud Barzanji, and Barzan, where I put 1914, which I think I'm going to remove because it's Sheikh Abdul Salam, and that wasn't really related to oil. And 1931 to 1932, which is Sheikh Ahmad Barzan, brother of the KDP legendary leader Mullah Mustafa Barzani, but were deliberately suppressed by British administrators as Kurdish autonomy or independence threatened British control over northern Iraq's oil. This study traces the systematic mechanisms behind the suppression. So the first is the manipulation of administrative boundaries to secure oil-rich lands. Sort of like, why was Mosul included in Mesopotamia at the time? So we had like the armistice of Mudros is sort of the key thing to look at, and diplomatic talks between England and France for who actually controlled Mosul, because Mosul in the Sykes-Picot Agreement was actually originally meant to be French, not British, but the British occupied it with troops, and there was sort of a here and there, and there was an agreement in December 1918 between Lloyd George and the French Prime Minister to transfer Mosul to Britain, and also the San Remo Conference of 1920, which institutionalized the concession architecture within the Turkish Petroleum Company, sort of which countries have a certain percentage of shares within the company. So this was sort of the Mosul petrol, like sort of oil. And basically so what I'm arguing is that because of this concession architecture, Mosul was included within Iraq. the purging of pro-Kurdish political officers. So here I look at Major Noel and Major Soane, who are two sort of the most pro-Kurdish British officers, which were purged sort of by the main leaders of sort of Iraq's construction. So Arnold Wilson, Percy Cox, Henry Dobbs, etc. They purged these Kurdish officers. The co-optation and crushing of Kurdish political leaders. So how they put Kurdish leaders against Kurdish leaders. For example, the British relied heavily on like the Jaff tribe, or who they co-opted very heavily, and other leaders like Sheikh Abdul Qadir, Saeed Taha, I think his name was, as well. Just Kurdish leaders, and another one's like Hamid Baban, I think his name was, who were basically under the wing of the British and sort of divided the Kurds between the ones that wanted Kurdish independence, like Sharif Pasha, Mahmoud Barzanji, even Simko Aga, if you want to, because he's mentioned quite a lot, and then the ones that were sort of under the pay of the British on the other side. The engineering of Kurdish political consent through rigged elections. So in that, I primarily look at the 1921 Faisal election, but even then, there's many other Iraqi elections where sort of there was a lot of rigging for Arab sort of rule of Kurdish districts like Suleymania, Kirkuk, etc. And identity declarations and the construction of a concession architecture that rooted Kurdish oil revenues through a Baghdad-centric framework, like I mentioned. This project will draw on extensive primary source research at the National Archives, so the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, the Cabinet, Air Ministry, India Office, and Petroleum Department records, the Gertrude Bell Archive, the Churchill Archives, the Curzon Papers, the Mark Sykes Papers, and the BP Archive at Warwick. I also have some other archives that I haven't added there from other countries, sort of like the French, we have the American NARA, the British High Commission files in India, etc., etc. But I have many files, many files. Sort of, I have them all sort of listed on a document here, but they've been transcribed, and I have copies of them that I've gone to scan, which already a year early is great, so I don't have to do as much next year. And I think in my next video, I'm going to look more at the files that I have transcribed. But this was sort of a basic overview of what my sort of dissertation wants to be about. We'll see if it is. But thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed.